Well, welcome to this second webcast in the Science for Peace series on overcoming the climate crisis. My name is Richard Sandbrook, and I'm co-hosting this session with Arne Jurgensen, who you'll meet in a few minutes. The first webcast, about a month ago, addressed the issue of what needs to be done to avert a climate catastrophe. This was a rather technical or mainly technical webinar in which we discovered the sources of greenhouse gases and how they might be diminished and eliminated by various policies and measures over many years. The conclusion we came to, at least I came to in that session, was that actually we know what to do about the climate crisis. We know the science, we have the technology, we have the financial resources, and so we could actually deal with the climate crisis, but we don't do so. So this second webinar deals with a follow-up question. That is, how can we ensure that what needs to be done gets done? How do we ensure that we can create a just transition? Or in other words, how can we get to a Green New Deal? The names differ, but the idea is basically the same, a significant transformation both socially and ecologically. So that's what we're dealing with. That's our main topic today. And many of us believe, including myself, that we're not likely to be able to deal with this crisis in the short term available unless we have a strong and united grassroots movement compelling governments to act. And so today we are actually addressing this issue of the likelihood of such a movement developing. Actually, it already is developing, but growing, becoming stronger, and how effective that movement might be. Before saying anything more about movement politics, I would like to briefly and rather bluntly make sure we all understand how difficult a situation we are in at the moment when it comes to the climate. Because actually climate change is taking place faster than was projected by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in its reports in 2017 and 2018. Now, I'm not an expert on climate science, far from it, but I do belong to Science for Peace and thereby have access to those who do have the expertise. And they have had me read a variety of articles in 2020, published in 2020 and 2021, as to what is happening on the climate scene. And well, to begin with, in 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a report on how the world could limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade by 2100. And the conclusion was, or the judgment was on the part of this prestigious group of scientists, that we would need to cut carbon emissions by half by 2030 and achieve a net zero carbon world by 2050 in order not to exceed the 1.5 degrees centigrade goal in 2100. And they emphasized that missing that goal is extremely significant, that there's an enormous difference in terms of climate between an average warming of 1.5 degrees centigrade and an average warming of 2 degrees centigrade. Even that 0.5 degrees makes an enormous difference. So the issue is we have a situation where there is more warming than was even forecast in 2018, 2019, more climate events happening. It appears that the amount of carbon in the atmosphere is actually more dangerous than was previously thought, and plus also the oceans and the biomass have a decreasing capacity to absorb carbon dioxide. So it makes our task um, of trying to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade very, very major. It is, I can say without any without any exaggeration, that we have entered the most decisive decade in the history of human beings. What we do in the next 10 years will tell us whether we're going to have a future that many of us will want to live in. It's a very grim situation, and not many people realize how bad the situation. So the question is, what do we do about it? Let's think about that for a minute. Well, individual efforts to reduce one's carbon footprint are very worthy and should be certainly applauded. And we should all try and cut down our traveling and recycle and so on, but that's not going to be enough. We can't rely on technology. We can't rely on a technological breakthrough. It might possibly happen, but it might not happen, soon enough. It might happen too late, or if we get into geoengineering, that kind of technology might have very dire unintended consequences for the Earth. So we can't rely on technology to save us. And we really can't rely either on politics as usual to resolve this crisis. Yes, it's important to support the party that holds to our vision of a green future. And yes, it's important to lobby on green issues. It's very important. There's no doubt about it. It's important to attend climate protests. But the fact is, there are many obstacles to within the existing political systems of all countries, which is impeding treating a climate emergency, as a warlike situation which requires the mobilization of all resources. Let's consider just somewhat those obstacles are very, very briefly. One, of course, is a set of vested interests linked to the fossil fuel industry. That includes large energy corporations, which indeed are trying to do a better job, but have a long way off from succeeding in that. It also includes the petrochemical industries, the military-industrial complex, which is so dependent on oil. So there are many strong forces still behind the fossil fuel existing kind of economy. As well, there is the culture of possessive individualism, which is now exists on a global level. The middle class throughout the world, in the global south, as well as in other parts of the world, China, is growing and understandably wants to engage in the consumer society. So we have the whole culture of possessive individualism to contend with as well. And finally, just to mention another major problem, we have the rise of the right-wing populists in many countries throughout the world. And right-wing populists may be like Trump and say that climate change is an enormous and expensive hoax, quote unquote. But others do not say it's a hoax. They say it exists, but it's not really that much of a problem. They tell people what they want to hear, which is that we don't have to engage in sacrifices. Things will be okay. We don't need to have carbon taxes. They thrive on climate change, on opposing climate change and telling people what they want. And what is even more dangerous in this situation is a general disparagement of scientific knowledge and experts in the field at a time when we need that expertise. We need the science very much in which to go forward into a climate, carbon neutral future. So there are major impediments. What it means is that governments and politicians are afraid of going too far they may individually may believe there's a climate emergency, but when it comes to the actual policies, they don't move far enough because they fear that if they do so, they'll lose their donors and their supporters, especially with right-wing populist parties that are gaining, if they're not in power, they're gaining support in many countries and thereby drawing the parties of the middle more towards the right. So this is a very dangerous situation. And this is the kind of political context in which we can see the importance of a grassroots movement pressing for for treating climate crisis as an emergency. In the first case, as I've said, that the movement would be there to compel governments, not only to themselves carry out programs, but also, of course, to engage in global cooperation, because the problem is not a national one or a local one, it's a global one, requires global solutions. But there's another important rationale for a grassroots movement, and that is to ensure that the transition to a carbon neutral future is a just transition. The importance of a just transition can be seen in two ways. First of all, creating a society in which opportunity is widespread, in which people can experience freedom, not just the top 5%, but everyone can have a chance to fulfill their goals and live a long and satisfying life, is a very important goal in itself. But beyond that, the just transition is a means to an end. To motivate people to undertake the uncertainties and the costs of carrying through this great transformation of society to try and save the planet, you're going to have to provide people with an idea, a vision of a society in which they can see themselves, as achieving a good life. For many people, it can be a better life than we have now. Actually, we're going through the fourth industrial revolution, which means we have the productivity enhancing technology and artificial intelligence, which is increasing our potential to create wealth with fewer resources and fewer hours of work. And if that income was redistributed in a proper way, we could all live a very good life. So the point about climate movement, about the importance of a mass movement, is not only to compel governments, but to create the justice in the process that can motivate people and create a better world. It's something we can do. And tonight we're going to discuss movement politics. What are the prospects for such a movement? It already exists. It's not just a fantasy. It's already growing, and especially since the last financial crisis in 2008, there's been an enormous increase in protest activity throughout the world. In almost every country of every sort, there is this kind of protest movement. And as well, the climate movement has come on the scene in a very strong way since 2018 with the Fridays for Future protests throughout the world. So the movement is already in process. How can it be effective? How can it overcome divisions? These are the sort of questions we'll have a chance to look at this evening.